Thank you for joining us here on Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing. If you're responsible for training the next generation of lab professionals or looking to level up your own expertise, you're in the right place. My name is Jessica Martin, and I'm a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I'm here to dive with you into the real-world strategies, expert insights, and game-changing discussions that will help us develop lab professionals who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
It's 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. You're a second-year grad student in a biological chemistry, and it's been a long day. Classes, teaching, prepping for that small conference next week, and finishing slides for tomorrow's group meeting. Now, the building is quiet. The hum of the fume hoods is the only sound left. You push your safety glasses up onto your head and rub the tiredness from your eyes. You think, perfect time to finish one more thing. You need to add 4% glutaraldehyde to a reaction. You remember your lab mate just used a particular tube for this step. So you walk over to their bench to grab it. As you lift the tube, a small splash arcs through the air. Before you can react, it hits your eyes. A sharp burn. Instant panic. You freeze for half a second. Glutaraldehyde, highly corrosive, dangerous to your eyes. You clamp your eyes shut against the pain, stretching your hands out. Where is the eye wash station? You start moving toward it, bumping into glassware and hearing it crash to floor. You feel something wet seeping into the bottom of your left hand leg. What was in that flask? Your phone isn't in your pocket. You can't even picture where you last set it down. And the lab is empty. You wonder if anyone is still working late in one of those labs across the hall. Hoping someone can hear you, you yell, "Help!"
In today's episode, Mila Kara is joining me to discuss lone work in wet labs. She is a research lab manager who cares deeply about making sure everyone feels safe and supported while working in the lab. She has a background in chemistry, chemistry education, and bioenergy, and she has been grappling with what it means to construct a useful lone work policy at a research university. If you work on a university campus, how aware are you of all the people working alone inside the wet labs? And have you ever thought about what compels them to do it despite all of the warnings not to work alone?
You think the simplest solution is just to ban working alone altogether. And some places do try that by limiting lab access to certain hours so people naturally end up working around the same time in the same spaces.
I've had experience with that as a researcher. When I worked at a research lab within a USDA facility, no one was allowed in our building between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. The security system of the building would automatically arm itself, so if you stayed in the building past 11 p.m., you would set off an alarm that would bring the fire department to the building.
So they really enforced it. That's a pretty strict way to ensure no one is in the facility at certain times. Of course, that still leaves plenty of hours when someone could be working without anyone else in the building.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, I still did do some work without anyone else in the building during my time there. It was a collection of lab groups sharing a building that worked independently of one another, similar in many ways to labs at a university.
Aha! Have you ever had an experience where you couldn't sneak in any lone work?
Well, I did work as an intern at a company in Germany for a few months. The policy there was that no one was allowed to be working inside of a lab if there was no one else in the building. Most of the lab personnel came into work pretty early, like 5 to 7 a.m., which also meant that they left pretty early. The labs were usually empty by about 4 o'clock. So throughout the day, there were always other people in the lab spaces working. While this prevented anyone from working in the lab alone, it also meant that everyone was competing for the same lab equipment during that time.
That sounds pretty hectic.
Yeah, I think it worked well for the regular staff since they knew their flows, but as an intern, it was a little frustrating. I chose to shift my working day later so that I didn't have to compete with so many people for the same lab equipment.
Wouldn't that mean you'd end up working when everyone else was gone?
Well, there were limits to my scheduled flexibility. I either had to have my lab work wrapped up by the time everybody else left the lab space, so like I said, about 4 o'clock, or else I needed to find a buddy in the building. And it was your buddy's responsibility to come to the lab and check on you every 30 minutes. It was a pretty small building, so people didn't have to walk very far from offices to check on someone in the lab.
So, who could serve as your buddy?
So everyone who worked there was able to serve as a buddy. It could be someone who is lab-based, but who happened to be doing work in their office later in the day, or it could be someone who never works in the lab. In fact, my most common buddy was the head of human resources, because she also shifted her schedule later than most, and everyone who worked there had access to the lab, so if they didn't see you through the windows, they could easily get in. And if your buddy had to leave and there was no one else there, then you had to stop working in the lab. The company culture helped ensure that no one was working late into the evening or into the night. Pretty typically, by about 7 o'clock, no one was there.
Sounds like a solid way to keep people from working alone when the whole building is empty. Perhaps that kind of buddy system could be a way forward for academic institutions too.
I often hear from safety professionals that they advise that lab work only happens during normal business hours so that there are people regularly around. However, when I was in graduate school, I found it really challenging to get my lab work done in normal working hours. The culture of work on a university campus is very different from both my USDA lab and the German company I described.
Do you feel like the culture was better at the USDA or at the company than it was at your university?
I don't think it was better. I think it was just different. There were different demands, different goals. Everyone's schedules worked differently. At the USDA and at my company, no one had classes to take or to teach. As a result, they never had to take that into consideration. Whereas at an educational institution, their primary job is education, and the people who do most of the work inside of research labs are graduate students. I don't think it is a matter of people really wanting to do lab work by themselves. It's just that there are only so many hours in the day. I found that given the demands of an educational institution, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get everything done in an 8-hour day, 5 days per week.
I suppose not everything has to get done during those standard working hours, but perhaps wet lab work does.
Well, people are around during those normal working hours because the things that demand lots of people to be present are occurring. Like classes, seminars, meetings. Many lab members can't do much lab-based work during this time because they have to attend many of those same events. Since lab-based work is performed mostly independently from others, the reality is that the lab work is what is easiest to schedule for non-standard hours.
And that's why just work during the day isn't really how it plays out in academia.
Right, because if most lab workers are graduate students, you can't separate lab work from everything else they're juggling.
Exactly. Teaching duties, classes, research deadlines. All of that shapes when people can be in the lab and how the work actually gets done.
And that's just one piece of it. Labs themselves can look completely different from one another. Some lab groups are large, with many people working together every day, while others might only have 1 or 2 members total.
Funding plays a big role too. Some labs are very well funded, and others are operating with far fewer resources.
Exactly. And even equipment use varies. In some lab groups, equipment is heavily shared, whereas in others, work may be differentiated enough that members typically use different equipment from one another.
Which means A policy that works in one lab might fall apart in another.
That's definitely true. I belonged to a smaller lab group. Our total lab membership stayed in the single digits the entire time I was there. My lab mates and I all had differing schedules based on when we entered the program, as well as what experiments we were running. Also, we often needed the same equipment, so if all of us were trying to get our experiments done during the same hours, there would be a lot of time just waiting around until equipment became available.
That does sound challenging. How did you handle the situation?
Well, I picked up the habit after a while of planning experiments on weekends. I did this because I noticed that the other members of my lab typically didn't come in all day on weekends. Personally, I liked working alone in the lab because everything was available right when I needed it, and I could get things done more quickly without other people in my way. Also, at times, it actually felt safer because there was no risk of bumping into someone else also working with hazardous materials.
It sounds like you were very intentionally choosing to work alone then.
Well, yeah. Frankly, with tough scheduling and limited resources, I found lots of motivations to work alone in academic research labs. I know this worries safety professionals and folks responsible for policymaking, and it probably should have worried me too. But if you don't consider those motivations, then you are just creating a policy that will be violated instantly, repeatedly, and frequently.
Did you find people in other labs who also came in on the weekends?
Oh, definitely. In fact, I noticed that there was a guy in the lab group next door who also came in all day on weekends and tended to be the only member of his lab who was there for the whole day. There was a door that connected our two labs, and we kept it closed during the week to reduce noise. However, without speaking to one another about it, one of us would always open that door on the weekends. Now, no particularly scary incidents occurred in my years doing this. However, there were times when one of us dropped something or started swearing, which always prompted the other to poke a head through that door and ask if everything was all right. We also tended to wave hello to the other when we got there and let the other know that we were leaving when we left.
If that was the case, were you truly working alone in the lab?
I did wonder about that. At one point, our EH&S folks decided to do a little campaign to emphasize our institution's no working alone policy. And I had a chat with a few of them in which I described my weekend arrangement, and I asked if anyone would think either of us was working alone. And to be honest, I got mixed reactions. Nobody seemed to agree. Also, it is important to realize that we never explicitly coordinated our schedules. So there were still times when one of us was working in a lab without the other person there. And our PIs weren't even aware that we were doing this with one another.
What you were doing sounds similar to the policy you described for the company you worked for.
Yeah, somewhat. The company trained and educated everyone on their policy, so the buddy system was understood and expected by everyone. Whereas in an academic institution, when crossing lab groups, it can feel like asking someone from the company next door to participate in a policy they know nothing about. Also, schedules are more standardized at the company, so I had a pretty good idea of who was around when I needed a buddy, whereas in an academic institution, people's schedules are all over the place and regularly change from term to term.
Some of the big takeaways for me from this conversation are that we really have to think about a lab's work culture and the resources it has. That's the only way to create and actually implement a lone work policy that supports the work people are doing while still keeping them safe. To build a sensible work alone policy, we also have to ask some fundamental questions. The first one is simple. Why shouldn't people work alone?
Well, I suppose that at the most basic level, we are expecting that other person to raise the alarm to someone who can actually help when something unexpected happens. On a deeper level, we are hoping that that other person knows how to react in a helpful way.
And this is why prevention matters so much. When no one is there to step in, even routine work can turn dangerous. In 2011, a tragic incident at Yale University underscored this risk. A 22-year-old undergraduate student was working alone late at night in a campus machine shop. She was operating a metal lathe, a powerful rotating tool, when her long hair became caught in the machine. Within seconds, the situation became fatal. It's a heartbreaking example of how quickly things can go wrong and why safeguards, training, and policies around working alone are meant to prevent tragedies like this from ever happening. We've included a link to the reporting in our show notes.
I do remember hearing about that when I was learning about the machine shop in my own building in graduate school. The guy training us was very insistent that we never work alone in that machine shop. And in terms of how to respond to an incident like that, it can be really scary since it would all happen so fast. At that basic level, if another person is present, do they immediately know the emergency numbers to call in order to get help as quickly as possible? And at a deeper level, would they know some quick action to take to stop the incident from getting worse? For example, would they know where the automatic shutoff is on the metal lathe to press it?
Exactly. While there are plenty of people who do not work with metal lathe, this story should prompt a PI to think about the machinery, instruments, particularly hazardous chemicals that are inside their own labs. In fact, this is something the OSHA laboratory standard even points to.
Really? I don't remember there being a section that discusses working alone.
Well, in section E of that standard, OSHA explains that a chemical hygiene plan has to cover several key elements and clearly spell out what the employer will do to protect people working in the lab. One of those elements is especially relevant here. It requires the plan to specify when a lab operation or activity needs prior approval from the employer or their designee before proceeding. We've included a link in the show notes in case you would like to review it.
Well, at a university, isn't the chemical hygiene plan a large, overarching document that doesn't really include such detail for the individual labs?
That's a really common assumption, but a well written university chemical hygiene plan should actually serve as a framework, one that helps each PI develop a chemical hygiene plan specific to their own lab. As the head of the lab, each PI should have a clear process for reviewing laboratory operations, procedures, or activities. Then, based on a risk assessment, they determine the conditions under which that work can be done, including whether someone else needs to be present in the room while it's happening.
Wow, I don't recall going through any processes like that when I was in graduate school. I remember there being a huge emphasis on establishing my independence as quickly as possible when it came to my laboratory experiments. My PI was very rarely in the lab at all, and while later career graduate students did help show me the ropes on a few things, we were all really busy and trying to get our own stuff done. It was not at all a common occurrence for us to discuss the details of laboratory experiments, and we certainly never delineated anything that required having another person present in order for us to be able to perform it.
Well, that is not an uncommon experience in graduate school.
There is a great deal of tension between establishing yourself as an independent researcher and performing lab work in collaboration with other people.
And this is where collaboration really matters. It can be the difference between a close call and a serious injury, or even death. It's worth asking whether there is anything in your lab where a small mistake could cause harm very quickly. If there is, do people know who to call for help? Do they know how to stop the situation from getting worse? And how to use those safeguards correctly? And all of that assumes, of course, that someone else is actually there with you in the room while the work is happening.
That does make sense. While establishing independence as a scientist is important, risk assessment is something that we should be learning along the way. And that should include an understanding of what can be done without someone else in the room and what cannot.
Exactly. So let's say that a lab has identified its really hazardous list, things that no one is allowed to do alone in the lab space ever. Does that mean that all other lab work can be done alone? And again, how do we define alone?
Yeah, I mean, accidents typically indicate that something unexpected happened, and as a result, they are difficult to predict. We can do the same risky action for years and never have an incident, or we can do something that we thought was non hazardous and yet sustain an injury anyway. And if you are operating in a space that contains a greater number and variety of hazards, such as a lab, even seemingly innocuous work can lead to an incident.
If you are shocked, pinned, splashed, or you faint in a freezer room and no one is going to be around for hours, it can be the difference between a minor injury and a tragedy. There are many haunting examples of how fragile the line can be between routine work and tragedy, and why lone worker safeguards matter. The danger isn't always the task itself, it is the lack of immediate help when unexpected things happen.
And some universities define lone work as any situation where if you became incapacitated, no one would know within a set period of time, say 15 or 30 minutes. In fact, this definition is alluded to in the book Prudent Practices, a commonly used resource for those working in chemical safety. We've linked it in the show notes in case you don't have a copy handy. Now, in this book, it states generally it is prudent to avoid working in a laboratory building alone. Under normal working conditions, arrangements should be made between individuals working in separate laboratories outside of working hours to cross-check periodically. Alternatively, security guards may be asked to check on the laboratory worker. That's a bit different from the way we were talking about working alone earlier.
Right, because under that definition, you could technically be alone in a lab or a shop for quite a while, as long as someone is checking in on you regularly. But it's important to emphasize that prudent practices is talking about normal working conditions when it discusses this kind of policy. The book also makes a very clear statement, which is experiments known to be hazardous should not be undertaken by someone working alone in a laboratory. So, a cross checking policy isn't a replacement. Some lab work is simply too dangerous to do alone, even for a short time. Even when you decide that certain tasks can be done solo, it's still not wise for someone to be alone in that space for extended periods.
Exactly. The policy assumes that if someone can look in on you every 15 to 30 minutes, then you're not truly alone in the building, even if no one's physically in the room with you the whole time.
And that difference really matters. There are many cases where simply having another person in the building can be life saving. One example comes from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, where a senior researcher was performing a distillation alone in the lab on a holiday. We've included a link to a description of that incident in the show notes.
Now, I wouldn't think of a distillation as something so hazardous that I would have to have someone else in the room at all times in order to perform it. The ones I have done have been pretty uneventful.
Exactly. But as we said before, accidents are often the result of unexpected or unplanned things happening. During this particular distillation, there was an explosion. The flask broke, flammable liquid splashed onto him, and glass cut an artery in his left forearm.
Whoa, that's scary.
He managed to get out into the elevator lobby where there was an emergency phone, but he lost consciousness before he could use it. What ended up saving him wasn't his own actions, it was the presence of someone else in the building. The flash fire triggered the fire alarm, and another person working nearby came to check it out. That person found him passed out, recognized how serious it was, and was able to get help and take action that ultimately saved his life.
Wow. That reminds me of a time years ago when I was working in my lab building over a holiday weekend. I didn't think of myself as doing anything hazardous. I needed some dry ice, which was kept in really large containers in an out of the way area of the basement of the building. I went down to get some and found that one of the containers had very little left in it. I lifted myself up onto the side of the container and reached down in with the scoop to get some. Then suddenly I started to feel lightheaded. I immediately jerked myself out of the container and pushed away from it, essentially throwing myself down onto the concrete floor. I took some deep breaths, and after a minute or two, my head cleared. I got up and walked around a bit and found that I was uninjured. Now, I felt like a complete idiot for having done that. I mean, if I had someone else try to stick their whole head in a container with dry ice in it, I probably would have stopped them. However, I did it without thinking, and it did occur to me that it was possible that days could have gone by without anyone finding me there if I had been incapacitated, either by passing out from the inhalation of the dry ice or if I had hit my head when I fell onto the floor.
That's honestly terrifying. And it connects so clearly to what we've been talking about. It's such a powerful example of how something that feels routine, something you've done 100 times before, can become dangerous very quickly, especially when you are alone. Not hazardous often just means hazardous but familiar. And that's exactly why institutions need to think carefully about how they construct lone worker policies. So, how do you actually build policies that fit the real work culture in an academic lab where people are so busy and schedules are so chaotic while still making sure no one is ever truly working alone?
When building a set of policies around wet lab work, it is important to consider the culture of work in the space and logistical feasibility. Having a better understanding of why people work the way that they do can help you build a system that supports that work while also keeping people safe. Due to the nature of laboratory accidents, no one should ever be working completely alone. However, building a system in which people are regularly checked on in some capacity can be incredibly challenging in academic institutions.
Right. For the cultural work in wet labs in academia, there are several things to consider. First, if your institution allows 24/7 access into lab spaces, then you have to assume that people can be working in the labs 24/7. Next, lab workers are typical graduate students who have to take classes and have teaching duties during the normal business day. They are members of lab groups who function independently from other lab groups, and they may be in lab groups with very few members. Is there any capacity at your institution or within your department to implement some sort of buddy system among those working in different lab groups?
It does seem like some sort of buddy system would be feasible, given that so many graduate students end up working odd hours. But effort from the department and PIs would have to be invested to normalize this as a practice.
You should also think about who else is around in these buildings, whether they are administrative staff, security personnel, or others. Do these people typically work more traditional schedules? Do they have access to the lab spaces? Is there any capacity at your institution or within your department to have some of these non lab people do regular walkthroughs And if so, how many hours of the day can their current schedules cover? Is there any way to extend those hours? You should also consider the purpose of having that other person present. Is everyone aware of emergency numbers? Is everyone aware of emergency off buttons or switches for equipment? Does everyone have hands on practice using available emergency equipment in the lab space or building? Are there any specialty emergency measures in the labs?
In addition to all of that, it's important to remember that discussions around policy can often feel far removed from the lab for the lab members themselves. Remember that in academia, these people are typically graduate students. Other lab members include undergraduate students, postdocs, and temporary staff members of various sorts. These people are all pretty far removed from the policy making.
It's important for all lab members to look for ways to engage with safety policies so they can help craft what will really make a difference in the labs. Even if you are not in management or a PI of a lab, there are things you can do now if you haven't already. First, save emergency numbers in your phone. Next, verify where the safety equipment is in your lab. Basic safety equipment for a lab includes eye wash stations, safety showers, first aid kits, chemical spill kits, fire extinguishers, and fire pull stations. Then start a conversation with your lab group about the possibility of a buddy system. See if there are opportunities in your department to bring up the idea of a buddy system that crosses different lab groups in a way that makes sense for spaces and working schedules.
In returning to the story that started this episode, we've left our second-year graduate student with their eyes tightly shut after splashing a bit of glutaraldehyde in them, an unknown liquid soaking the bottom of their jeans, and glass scattered on the floor. Consider what things could change in your own lab to better support this imaginary researcher in handling this situation. Some sort of buddy system really could make a huge difference here. So now we are curious to hear from you. If you are a member of a lab, do you feel like you have a good understanding of how to work safely during non-standard hours in your lab? If you are a PI, do you have discussions with your lab members about whether and how they are meant to work safely during non-standard hours? And if you're in leadership, how are you balancing productivity with the responsibility to keep people safe? Let us know by either emailing us at skilledsafeandtrailblazing@gmail.com, commenting in our LinkedIn community, linked in the show notes, or leaving a comment on this episode. Thank you to Mila Kara for joining us for this episode. And thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.